Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from the marina in Kalamata, Greece on April 14th, 2024. Today I would like to talk to you about something that happened last night, which is of potentially momentous importance to all of us, but particularly the people of West Asia. And that is the drone and missile strikes by the Iranian government and military on Israel in the early hours of the morning Athens time. And before I get into the subject of what happened, why I believe this happened, and where I think all of this is going, I want to offer you a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is simply this. In the course of discussing these subjects with you, I'm going to provide my opinion about whether I think that the missile and drone strikes were legally justified. And it won't surprise those of you who've followed my coverage of West Asia in recent weeks to know that I am going to opine, spoiler alert, that the Iranian attacks on Israel last night were completely justified from a legal perspective. But I want it to be known and understood, because I've seen how the public discourse works around, the official enemies of the West, that this is not some kind of general endorsement that I'm going to offer you of all of the activities or policies and practices of Iran's government. I'm limiting myself to this one extremely important question, one that has the potential to have implications for all of us, in my opinion, and that is whether there was a lawful justification for what Iran did. Now, before I get into the meat of that subject, let me say that the public discourse in the West around these attacks, the political elites, governments, political pundits, mainstream reporters, editors from major news organizations in the West, collectively what we're seeing, I think, constitutes one of the most extreme cases, if not the most extreme case in our lifetimes, of historical amnesia. I mean, it is not unusual. Those of us who are critical of Western media, mainstream media, and the political elites in the West, we are aware and have been for many years, and we talk about it regularly, that Western elites have a remarkable ability to efface from public discussion, and even from their own minds, it seems at times, historical events that are really important in terms of understanding how governments and movements and individuals act today. But in this case, they are effacing from public discussion an extraordinarily important and relevant event that happened less than 2 weeks ago. And that was Israel's destruction of the Iranian consulate in Damascus. This was an unequivocal, grave violation of international law, and particularly Article 22 of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which declares diplomatic missions to be inviolable. That's the word that it uses, and Israel is a party to this convention. It was also an unequivocal act of war on Iran. And let's remember, there's no discussion about this apparently. Nobody in the Western mainstream media, or almost nobody, seems to think that this is even worth discussing. And if it's raised at all, it's raised with a kind of dismissive attitude. Those silly Iranians, they're using the destruction of their consulate in Damascus as an excuse for attacking Israel. It's not an excuse. It provides an absolutely compelling lawful justification for what they did under the United Nations Charter, the right of self-defense, which they themselves have quite logically invoked. This was an attack on Iran. This was an attack, an act of war. This was a grave violation of international law. They have every lawful justification for responding militarily by attacking military targets. And let me say, at this stage, I have seen absolutely no evidence that the Iranians tried to attack civilian targets. All indications are that their attacks were upon military targets, and I'm going to get to that in more detail momentarily. But I also want to talk a little bit about the more distant history and how this impacts upon what Iran did. And this is just something that people, not people who are pro-Iranian, but people who just have a sense of fairness and decency and who are genuinely concerned about peace, they would be cognizant of these historical realities. First of all, there was the devastating war that Saddam Hussein waged against Iran shortly after the Islamic Revolution with the full support of the West. There's no question that the West backed him in this. And in fact, when I was in Baghdad recently and was speaking to a gentleman by the name of Hussein Baroud, who fought against Saddam Hussein's regime when he was a young man, spent 4 years in an internment camp in the Saudi desert, ended up emigrating to the United States, came back to Iraq in 2016 to help rebuild his country. You know, he told me that it's widely known in the region that the Saudis were absolutely appalled at the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and that they told the Americans in no uncertain terms that they would much rather have to deal with a Saddam Hussein in Iran, or somebody like Saddam Hussein, than having to deal with a Shia Muslim regime that was hostile to the pro-Western autocracies in the region. And that was a major factor in the decision of the United States government at the time to support the brutal dictator Saddam Hussein in his devastating war against Iran, which killed hundreds of thousands of Iranians. Then, of course, you have the sanctions on Iran, which were a violation of international law because they were done without the approval of the United Nations Security Council. They caused enormous damage for many years to the Iranian economy. They caused vast suffering to innocent Iranians, including Iranians who oppose the current government of Iran. That too was an enormous provocation, an illegal one. Then you have cyber attacks on Iran. And in particular, a computer worm by the name of Stuxnet was used by the Israelis and Americans to attack Iran's nuclear energy system. And actually that computer worm, as I understand it, became a problem for other information systems around the world. Whether that was intentional or not, I don't know. But in any event, this was a severe act of aggression against Iran. Then there was the assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists. One was killed. The head of Iran's nuclear program was murdered in 2020. And there's every reason to believe that the Israelis and or the Americans were involved in that somehow. Now, before I go on with the provocations, the historical provocations, I just want to, as a footnote, say that, you know, there is no merit whatsoever, in my opinion, to the argument that, you know, these cyber attacks on Iran's nuclear system and the murder of its nuclear scientists was justified by the desire of the United States and Israel to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. I don't want to see Iran get a nuclear weapon either. I don't want anybody to have a nuclear weapon. And frankly, the people who scare me the most in terms of the possession of nuclear weapons are the Israelis and the Americans, because they're depraved, hyper-violent, hyper-aggressive lunatics. In fact, the United States is the only nuclear power that has ever used nuclear weapons on a civilian population, and it did it twice. Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and nobody was held accountable for it. The United States knowingly incinerated tens of thousands of Japanese children when the Japanese military was on the verge of surrender. And why did they do this? Not to save American lives. They did this to send a message to the Soviet Union and to other potential rivals that there was a new sheriff in town, and that sheriff had nukes, and you'd better listen up. That was effectively why they killed all of those innocent civilians. And of course, look at the behavior of Israel in Gaza. I mean, these people running this government, and a large segment of the Israeli population that supports this government, are engaged in the most horrific depravity. Are these people capable of using nuclear weapons? I don't have any doubt in my mind that they are, and nor should you. So why do they get to have nuclear weapons? But Iran, which has been completely isolated or threatened with isolation and surrounded with U.S. military bases and constantly subjected to aggression by Israel and the United States, why shouldn't it have a nuclear weapon in order to deter their aggression? As I said, I prefer that nobody have any nuclear weapons, but there's really no justification for Israel and the United States to lecture other people about developing nuclear weapons when they themselves refuse to dismantle their own nuclear arsenals and are, by every indication, completely irresponsible in terms of how they manage them. I should also point out in that regard that the Israelis, Israel is the only state in West Asia that is not a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So all of this business about Iran having a bomb, which it doesn't, and the CIA, I think back in 2003, it was disclosed, had formed the opinion that the Iranians were not pursuing the development of nuclear weapons. And in 2016, or I should say in 2018, I believe it was, shortly after Trump came to power, he pulled the United States out of the Obama-era nuclear deal with Iran, which was designed to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, even though the International Atomic Energy Commission certified at the time that Iran was complying with the deal. And then, on top of all of this, putting aside the nuclear issue, you had the Trump administration's murder in broad daylight in Iraq, a sovereign nation, without the consent of the Iraqi government, of the top general in Iran, Qasem Soleimani, along with senior officials who had government status in Iraq from popular mobilization forces, Iraqis, murdered in broad daylight. Even then, the Iranians, although they did attack a U.S. military base, they refrained from attacking the territory of the United States directly after this flagrant act of war and grave violation of international law. And then, of course, you have all these attacks upon Iranian military personnel in Syria prior to the time of the destruction of the consulate of Iran in Damascus. And whatever you may think of the government of Bashar al-Assad or the man himself, the fact is that Bashar al-Assad is the internationally recognized leader of Syria. His government is the internationally recognized government of Syria, and as such, he is entitled to invite onto the sovereign territory of Syria whatever military forces he wishes to invite. The presence of Iranians, however noxious that may seem to the Israeli government, does not give them a lawful justification, nor a moral one, frankly, for killing Iranian military personnel, and doing so contrary to the wishes of the sovereign government of Syria, whose land, by the way, they have stolen. And I'm talking here specifically about the Golan Heights. I'll come back to that in a moment. So leading up to this, not only had the United States and Israel provided ample justification to the Iranians to commit direct attacks on American and Israeli targets, even on their own soil, but they had decided that that wasn't enough, and they were going to step up the provocation by doing something which has almost never been done, and that was destroying a diplomatic mission. The fact that there were people within that mission, as the Israelis have claimed, senior Iranian officials who were involved in arming resistance groups in the region, that provided no lawful justification whatsoever for what Israel did. If that was a lawful justification for what Israel did, then just about every U.S. and Israeli consulate on earth would be fair game. Because throughout the diplomatic missions of Israel and the United States, you have military and intelligence personnel who are engaged in or who are facilitating violations of international law and egregious violations of the sovereignty of other states. Are we to believe that every single or most of the diplomatic missions of the United States and Israel are now fair game? Because that's where the logic of Israel leads us. The fact of the matter is that the justification that Israel gave for destroying the consulate of Iran in Damascus is completely bogus from an international legal perspective. So Iran had every lawful right to do what it did. And the last thing I want to say about the subject of lawful justification, many people are out there saying, well, Iran is arming these groups, these terrorist groups in the region. Whatever terrorism these groups may be guilty of pales in comparison, as I've said many times, to the terrorism of the United States and Israel. I mean, Israel has killed 14,000 children in Gaza in 6 months. 14,000 children in Gaza in 6 months. According to Israel, Hamas killed in the range of 35 children. Palestinian militants killed in the range of 35 children on October 7th. And they call Hamas a terrorist organization, and they say that Israel is acting in self-defense. Give me a break. Okay, Israel is a terrorist state. It is a perpetrator of terrorism on an epic scale, and its terrorist crimes vastly surpass those of all of the Iran-backed resistance groups put together, many times over. The same is also true of the terrorism of the United States government. So if you take, again, Israel's logic to its natural conclusion, what you'd end up with is a justification for launching widespread attacks against American and Israeli military targets, both civilian and military. That's where their reasoning, so-called reasoning, leads you. So with that, I'd like to turn to the question of what actually happened last night. I've addressed thus far the question of the legality of what Iran did. Well, the early reports were that Iran had launched in excess of 150 drones at Israel. And I immediately got an email from a friend of mine who's Palestinian and said, I don't understand why the Iranians would simply launch 150 drones. That's not going to impose much of a threat. This looks like, theater. And I pointed out to him that over and over again in the Ukraine war, which I've been following very carefully for over 2 years now, not only the politics of it, the economics of it, but the military aspects of it to the best of my ability as a non-expert in military matters. I've seen this over and over again where the Russians would launch a large volley of drones into Ukraine, either shortly before or simultaneously with launches of cruise and ballistic missiles. And this was designed to both exhaust and confuse the air defense systems of Ukraine, and it was very effective. And just so you understand, again, I'm not an expert in air defenses or missile technology or military matters generally, but my understanding is, these various projectiles have different speeds and different trajectories. A cruise missile tends to fly very low to the ground, horizontally more or less, and it can maneuver quite dramatically, as a matter of fact. Drones, and they can be quite fast. They can be supersonic. I think it's even possible, at least theoretically, for them to be hypersonic. And then you have drones, which can fly at different altitudes, but they fly much more slowly than cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. And they generally have much less explosive power, and they are maneuverable, although perhaps not quite as maneuverable as, let's say, a very sophisticated and advanced cruise missile. And then you have ballistic missiles, and my understanding of ballistic missiles is that they have a parabolic trajectory, so they go way up and then they come down, almost in a vertical line. And they reach astonishing speeds as they're coming down, which makes them extremely difficult to take out with an air defense system. And also, when they strike the earth, because of the speed at which they're traveling, they cause massive damage. And so my understanding, and this was the reports that we started to receive shortly after the initial reports of a drone launch, is that Iran had also launched cruise and perhaps also ballistic missiles. So they seem to have been employing tactics that the Russians have perfected. And by the way, the Russians have completely destroyed almost completely destroyed Ukraine's air defenses. And I think it's fair to say that the Russians at this stage, because of this 2 years of warfare against advanced air defense systems and missiles in the Ukraine war, probably the most sophisticated military actor when it comes to missile technology and air defenses in the world today. And it's, as is widely known, they're closely allied with Iran. It would be very surprising to me if they are not providing and have not provided some level of expertise to the Iranians in terms of how to launch these missile attacks, how to defend against missile attacks, and how to develop these technologies, including hypersonic missiles. I'm not saying they've given hypersonic missiles to the Iranians. I don't think they would do that. But have they given technological assistance to the Iranians when it comes to missile technology and missile warfare? I think that's very, very plausible. And that spells trouble for Israel and its Western backers. In any event, initially it seemed these drones were dealt with more or less effectively by Israel's air defenses. But as the cruise missiles and ballistic missiles started coming in, they became overwhelmed. They continued to take out a number of these projectiles, but some of them escaped, and particularly the ballistic missiles. And the reports these are unconfirmed, that somewhere between 5 to 7 ballistic missiles hit one air base, and up to 15 ballistic missiles hit another Israeli air base. These are air bases in Israel. One of these air bases, the Ramon Air Base, is 1,300 kilometers from the western border of Iran. And the other one is almost 1,100 kilometers, the Nevatim Air Base. Iran also claims to have struck the military installation on top of Mount Haran in the occupied West Bank, which, as I indicated, is actually sovereign Syrian territory. It's not Israeli territory at all. And it claims to have destroyed this installation, which is apparently very important for military intelligence gathering for Israel. And according to Iran, one of these bases, I believe it was the Ramon Air Base, and the Meron military installation, the Golan Heights, were involved in the destruction of the consulate of Iran in Damascus a few days ago. And so the Iranians have struck targets that were directly related to, according to their version of events, directly related to the aggression and the act of war launched against them by Israel in early April. Some of the things that I think are looming large here, which are not going to be much discussed in the mainstream media, are, first of all, the claim, well, this claim is being widely and uncritically repeated by the Western mainstream media, and that is the claim that the Israeli military shot down 99% of these projectiles, and that the very few that got through, the 1% that got through, caused very little damage to one military base. This is the Israeli version. The first thing I'll say about this is, by now it should be clear to any sensible person that the Israeli military has absolutely no credibility. So if they make a claim which is self-serving, it serves their interests, and they do not accompany the claim with independent, objective, credible evidence, you should attach zero weight to it. Zero. Absolutely none. Doesn't mean they're lying necessarily, but you should not believe for 1 minute that it constitutes any kind of evidence. It could be a complete fabrication. Secondly, based upon the reports I've seen from people who are experts in missile defense, the claim that the Israelis managed to shoot down 99% of these projectiles, particularly given the sophistication of Iranian missile technology and the size of this volley, is highly implausible. The estimates I've seen are more like initially they would have shot down about 50%, and when the further waves came in, the efficacy rate might have dropped to as low as 30% or even 10%. So it's highly unlikely, I think, that 99% of these projectiles were shot down. Moreover, in terms of the claim of the Israeli military that one military base suffered slight damage, there are videos circulating of what appears to be a military base in the distance, of numerous ballistic missiles striking the military base, and there being huge ground explosions. So it seems somewhat implausible that these military bases, no military base in Israel, suffered substantial damage. I'm not saying that any of them was necessarily destroyed and rendered completely unusable, but the idea that none of them suffered even significant damage, again, I think that's highly implausible, and as I say, the Israeli military has zero credibility. Another interesting factor here, and this is one of the things I don't think is going to get much discussed in the West, is that according to Israeli media, the approximate cost of the missile defenses that were brought to bear, I mean, I'm talking here about the actual missiles that were used, and they didn't just use land-based air defense systems. Apparently they launched aircraft and used missiles fired from aircraft in order to bring down projectiles fired from Iran. And I believe also vessels, naval vessels from the United States and Britain were potentially involved. But according to the Israeli media, the approximate cost of these, or value of these items, was $1.35 billion. $1.35 billion. In 2022, the last year for which there are official full-year figures for Israeli military spending, the Israeli military budget was somewhere in the range of $24 billion. What this means, if these figures from Israeli media are accurate about the approximate value of the missiles expended last night, is that Iran managed to cause Israel to expend in a matter of a few hours, in excess of 5% of its 2022 annual military budget. Folks, this is economically unsustainable, to put it mildly, especially for such a small country like Israel. The other thing I think that is noteworthy, and again, this is something that's not going to be looked at critically by the Western mainstream media, is that, yes, the Americans and the British are bragging about the fact that they helped bring down a number of these, they actually brought down themselves a number of these missiles and drones, and, greatly eased the burden on the Israeli air defense system. Well, that suggests to me, particularly when you consider that a number of these missiles actually got through and did do some damage, that suggests to me that Israel's air defense systems, standing alone, are substantially inadequate to defend Israel from Iran's missile attacks. And if the British and the Americans weren't there to help out, Israel would be in serious trouble. The other thing I think bears remembering is that on October 7th, Hamas began its attacks on Israel, or preceded its attacks on Israel, with huge volleys of missiles fired from Gaza into Israel, thousands of them. I vaguely recall the number was somewhere in the range of 6,000 missiles. And these are much less precise. They are not maneuverable at all, they pack much less of a punch, much less sophisticated than Iran's missiles. And yet, quite a few of them managed to get through Israel's air defenses on that day. And as was widely reported at the time, the reason this happened is because of the sheer volume of the missiles. And any air defense system, experts reported at the time, no matter how sophisticated and effective it may be, can be overwhelmed by volume. A huge volley of missiles, especially when they come in waves, one after the other, and they are, flying different trajectories and at different speeds, and have different levels of maneuverability. So, if Hamas was able to evade Israel's air defenses by the sheer volume of its missile launches, imagine what Iran can do, which has far more missiles than Hamas, and far more sophisticated and maneuverable missiles than Hamas. Far faster missiles than Hamas. And in fact, Iran is reputed to have and to have used last night hypersonic missiles, which no air defense system possessed by the West is capable of shooting down. None. Not even the Patriots, not the Iron Dome, none of them. So what does this say about the military prospects of Israel going forward? If this war escalates out of control, and both Iran and Hezbollah, which has well in excess of 100,000 missiles remaining and has not used its most effective missiles so far in the 6 months of violence on the southern border of Lebanon, if they both bring to bear in a major way their missile arsenals, this is going to have devastating impacts on Israel. Absolutely devastating impacts on Israel. And there's nothing really that the United States can do to stop that. The United States and Israel can, of course, inflict horrible damage and suffering on both Lebanon and Iran and any other actor in the Middle East that offers, resistance to Israel Western hegemony in the region. That's to be sure. No one should have any illusions about that they are both capable and morally capable and militarily capable of causing untold, spectacular, and horrific suffering throughout the region. But can they stop Israel from being devastated by missile attacks? I think last night, what we learned about last night, notwithstanding the bombastic claims of the Israeli military, is that they're not going to be able to stop Israel from suffering devastating impacts from a full-scale missile war with Iran and Hezbollah. All of this, of course, militates for restraint. And in that vein, the New York Times reported today that unnamed sources from the Biden administration told the New York Times that Biden and his inner circle have been having conversations today with Netanyahu and other senior figures from the Israeli military, and have been telling them that in light of this spectacular victory that they earned last night by shooting down 99%, allegedly, of the projectiles fired by Iran, it might not be necessary for Israel to engage in a retaliatory attack. And according to some reports, Netanyahu quickly got the backing of his war cabinet to launch a retaliatory strike on Iran, but rescinded the decision after being approached by Biden himself and other senior officials in the Biden administration. And after this pitch was made to them, that it might not be necessary. Notice a couple of things here. First of all, why are these sources unnamed? Why is this not being attributed to any actual person in the Biden administration? But much more importantly, why did they use that language? Might not be necessary. It's not reported that Biden said that it isn't necessary and that Israel must not, under any circumstances, launch a retaliatory strike. Effectively, what Biden is reported to have done was to have tried gently to plant a seed in Netanyahu's depraved mind that maybe he shouldn't escalate the war any further. That, ladies and gentlemen, to my mind, is a green light. Biden has effectively given the green light to Netanyahu to launch a retaliatory strike. And in fact, I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that that is precisely what Israel is going to do. It's just a question of how big that strike is going to be and when and how it's going to be delivered. For example, and this is a very, very important question, will it be a direct strike by Israel on the territory of Iran? If I were a betting man, and I used to be one day, I would say yes, it's likely to be a direct strike on the territory of Iran. But a very serious strike on Iranian military installations or personnel outside of Iran may be enough to provoke a further retaliatory strike by Iran. Certainly, a strike by Israel on Iran's actual physical territory is going to elicit, as the Iranians have said very clearly, and at this point I don't think anybody should think they're bluffing, a retaliatory strike which will be much worse than the one they delivered to Israel yesterday. I can't for the life of me imagine that Benjamin Netanyahu, with all of the aggressions and the depravity and the lawlessness and the criminality that he has displayed over the years, and with his fanatical belief that the only way for Israel to maintain dominance in the region is to inflict terrifying losses on their opponents, I can't imagine that this man is going to be able to restrain himself from a retaliatory strike. Moreover, I think that Joe Biden understands this perfectly well. So do the people in his inner circle. In fact, he may have been told explicitly by Netanyahu that there is going to be a retaliatory strike at some point in some way. But that it's coming, of that I am absolutely sure, folks. And I think the only reason that Biden administration officials went to the New York Times and said this today, that they told Netanyahu that it might not be necessary to launch a retaliatory strike on Iran, it's the same reason for which they've been going to the media repeatedly and saying that they're frustrated with Netanyahu's handling of the war in Gaza, and that they think, that Netanyahu is being over the top and he has to rein it in, and they're becoming increasingly frustrated about the way he's prosecuting the war. We've been hearing this for 6 months, and yet they just keep shoveling weapons at Israel's genocidal regime. It's all kabuki theater. It's all designed to persuade us that Joe Biden has a conscience, that Joe Biden is a peacemaker, that Joe Biden's hands are tied. Israel's a sovereign nation. It's going to do what it's got to do. All he can do is try to use his powers of persuasion, his appeal to morality and reason, to try to stop Netanyahu from his next depravity. This is kabuki theater, folks. There is a retaliatory strike coming, and the impact is going to be potentially devastating on us all. It is not simply a question of the millions, and I say millions, in all seriousness, of lives that could be lost in a full-scale war in the Middle East involving all of Iran's allies, and potentially involving people who rise up against Western-backed autocrats like the Jordanian king. Not only could this result in millions of deaths, but it is going to have absolutely devastating impacts on the global economy because of the global economy's reliance on oil and gas from the Middle East. And in fact, just before the drone and missile strikes on Israel last night, the Iranians seized an Israeli-owned or connected vessel in the Strait of Hormuz. And I think that they did that to send a message. Just a reminder to the Biden administration and other Western governments that they can easily shut down the Strait of Hormuz. And we're already seeing drastically reduced flows of commercial maritime traffic through the Red Sea. So no one should have any illusions about where this is heading. Ultimately, I stand by the analysis that I offered very early in this genocide, that Israel is hurtling towards a strategic defeat. This will be a multifaceted defeat. It will be an economic defeat, a political defeat, and a military defeat. All of those spheres will be impacted in Israel in such a way as to lead ultimately to the destruction of the Zionist regime. Something new is going to emerge out of it. Let us hope that it is something far more humane than what Israel has become. The problem we have is that in the interim, Israel and its Western backers have both the moral capacity or lack thereof and the physical means to cause massive levels of destruction, not only to all the peoples of West Asia, but beyond the region itself. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on April 14th, 2024.